I have loved wild places for as long as I can remember. My earliest memory is of standing on a weather-beaten porch high in the Colorado Rockies, breathing air so clean it hurt my lungs. I was 8 years old, bundled in a red parka 2 sizes too big, watching my dad unload fishing gear from the back of our old Ford Bronco. The porch belonged to a tiny log cabin 6 miles west of Leadville near Turquoise Lake Road. My parents had found it through a neighbor who knew the owner, and for 3 straight summers we drove up from Denver to spend a few August nights there. I would wake before sunrise to hear elk bugling down in the valley and fall asleep to the soft hiss of wind pushing through lodgepole pines. Those trips fix the mountains inside me ever since. When city traffic closes in and work emails burn holes in my screen, my mind drifts back to that porch, the smell of pine sap, and the feeling that the world is still wide and empty and good. 21 years later, I decided I needed that feeling again. I had just wrapped up a brutal software rollout, eating takeout dinners at my desk for weeks. My eyes stung, my head buzzed, and my apartment in Denver felt like a cave filled with humming electronics. So I opened Airbnb, typed Leadville cabin, and there it was, a familiar slanted roof and rough yew railings, the same view of pine trunks marching downhill toward Turquoise Lake. The listing said the place had been renovated now with solar panels and reliable Wi-Fi, but everything else, the location, the porch, and even the dusty gravel driveway, matched the photos from my childhood scrapbook. The host profile name was Heather, but the original owner's last name, Alvarez, still appeared in the property description. I booked 6 nights without thinking twice. On Monday, September 5th, loaded my Subaru Outback with a week's groceries, an DSLR camcorder, an aging golden retriever mix. Then drove west on US Highway 24. The sky was postcard blue, and the aspens along the Arkansas River were already hinting at gold. 90 miles later, I crested Tennessee Pass. The air temperature dropped a good 10 degrees, and every breath tasted like cold metal. By noon, I reached Leadville, grabbed a tank of gas, then bumped along County Road 4, past the turnoff to Sugarloaf. Damn! Cell service faded to 0 bars, just as Heather's check-in instructions warned. Finally, I saw the old mailbox painted hunter green. The numbers 20 and 44 are still stenciled on the side. My tires crunched up the familiar drive, Porter's tail thumping against the back seat. The cabin looked smaller than in my memory, but time does that. The logs were darker. The porch rail is slick from years of snow and thaw, yet everything felt exactly right, like a page I had left unturned for 2 decades. I punched in the key code Heather sent. The door clicked, and I stepped into a single-room space, warmed by late afternoon sun. A new cast-iron stove squatted where the stone fireplace once stood, and fresh wiring hid behind pine paneling. But the knot pattern on the floorboards was the same. Porter circled twice on a throw rug and went to sleep. I opened every window so the cabin could breathe, then brewed coffee on a compact induction burner outside. In a breeze the aspens rattled. Everything in me loosened. The first 2 days passed in a peaceful rhythm. I woke at dawn, brewed strong coffee porter down, and took to the edge of Turquoise Lake, where the water shone like glass under the 10-mile range. I wrote code reviews on my laptop in the morning, napped after lunch, and hiked the Timberline Trail before sunset, retracing steps I once tackled a child's legs. Each night, I sat on the porch with a headlamp and a paperback, listening to coyotes in the distance. I saw no hikers, no neighbors, no cars, only an occasional flash of high-altitude jet traffic against the stars. On the third afternoon, Wednesday, September 7th, the wind shifted. Gray clouds pushed over Mount Massive, bringing an early hint of snow. I bundled into a fleece and stacked firewood beside the stove, expecting a cold night by 6. The light was fading, and sleet tapped against the windows of the porter. Lay up my feet while I answer work emails. At 6:22 p.m., according to the little digital clock on the side table, someone knocked on the front door. The sound was hard, deliberate. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. I froze. In 3 days, I had not seen another person. Within half a mile, I set my laptop aside and whispered. Stayed a porter, though. He was already up, tail stiff. Another knock louder. I stepped to the window, careful not to show my full face. A man stood on the porch, late 30s, a tan canvas, maybe wearing jacket soaked dark at the shoulders. He wasn't dressed for mountain weather, no hat gloves. His truck, no, if he had one, was nowhere in view. I cracked the door an inch, just enough for my voice. Can I help you? He smiled too quickly. Hey man, sorry, I'm not a stranger to this place. He said, I was here last week with my girlfriend who left. Something important inside. Any chance you can let me in so I can grab it? The story felt wrong in a half-dozen ways. The listing showed no bookings in early September. The host lived hours south in Buena Vista. And I remembered Heather mentioning she stayed fully booked for the fall leaf season. Also, people who truly forgot valuables usually mention a specific item he hadn't have. Did you talk to Heather? I asked. He shook his head like I was slow. She's not answering. Look, man, Porter growled behind me. It'll take 30 seconds. The man rocked back, eyes shifting past me into the cabin. I caught a whiff of alcohol mixed with damp flannel. I'm sorry. I said I can't let anyone in to call the host and arrange a time. The man's smile cracked. I'm telling you I was here. That lamp, he pointed over my shoulder at a bronze lamp on a side table. I know every inch of that place. I closed the door a bit more. Have a good night. Then I threw the deadbolt and stepped back. The man's face hardened. He pounded the door with an open palm and muttered something I couldn't make out, then stomped off the porch. I listened for a car engine, but heard only sleet on the roof. After a minute of silence, I exhaled Porter he was, told good, and decided to fry some. 15 minutes later, a second knock made me drop the frying pan. This time, the sound was lower, a fist driving wood into the frame. Porter barked, something he rarely does. Heart thumping. I grabbed my phone, but there was no service. Then the only weapon in reach was a cast iron skillet, still hot from the stove. I crept to the peephole. Heather had installed it. Instead of one visitor, there were 3. The original man stood with his right shoulder. Hunched beside him were 2 others, dressed head to toe in black, hoodies and jeans. Each was wearing a plain cloth mask, the kind you buy in bulk at hardware stores. One of them tapped the door's center panel with the tip of a large knife, scraping like he was doodling invisible circles. The blade looked at least 8 inches long. My throat went dry. The cabin had 1 entrance. The windows were old, but solid, double-latched from the inside. My car keys were on the coffee table, but the Outback sat 20 yards from the porch with its nose aimed away from the only drivable track. Even if we made it to the car, reversing down that narrow path in sleep with panic in my veins felt like a gamble. Hiding seemed worse. The cabin was 1 room. No loft, only choice was no basement. My to stall and pray. Someone would drive by, though I knew that was unlikely. After sunset, a muffled voice came through the door. "Open up, man. No one needs to get hurt. We need your help. That's all." My mouth felt full of cotton. I managed to answer. "I've called the police." It was a lie, but maybe enough bluff to buy time. The man in the tan jacket laughed. "No, you didn't. No service out here. You think we don't know that?" Behind me, Porter barked again, claws skittering on the floorboards. A masked man kicked the door hard. The frame shuddered. I scanned for anything to slow them. The cast iron stove, a heavy log chair, a can of bear spray half used on a trail. Last spring, I grabbed the spray slid safety clip free, and pointed it at the door from 10 feet back. Bear spray travels 25 feet in fog and blinds on contact. My hand shook so hard, I almost pressed the trigger too early. Another kick split the lower hinge. A masked man shouted, "Last chance." I squeezed the trigger. An orange cloud erupted through the gap where the latch met. The jam is hissing like a busted pipe. Someone on the porch screamed a curse. The door rattled again. Then, all 3 sets of footsteps retreated, fast off the boards in silence. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Then coughing, gagging, "You idiot." One man groaned, voice cracking under pepper burn. I waited, thumb still depressing the trigger until the can hissed empty. The metallic click of the valve going dry was the loneliest sound I have ever heard. For 2 eternal minutes, nothing moved. Porter is pawing at my leg. I whispered, "Good boy," and kept my eyes on the door. The wind gusted, shaking sleet loose from the roof. Then I heard feet crunching on gravel. A car engine turned over, sputtered and roared to life. Tires spun, throwing rocks. Headlights swung across the front windows, lighting the cabin ceiling. Amber for a heartbeat before sweeping away into darkness. The engine noise faded down the road. I slumped to the floor, arms rubbery. Porter crawled into my lap, trembling. I stroked his fur and tried to breathe without tasting the pepper that hung faintly in the air, like hot dust. My watch read 6:57 p.m. Less than 40 minutes had passed since the first knock. The adrenaline drop hit me in waves, with shaky hands, ringing ears, and a sudden urge to vomit. But I had to get help. I yanked a fleece over Porter's sleet, which still fell outside. Stepping onto the porch, I almost slipped. Bear spray residue made the board slick. The air reeked of chili and chemicals. A black pickup with mud splattered plates was already a distant spot of taillights with no cell signal. I locked the cabin lead, Porter, and jogged a half-mile uphill to a bend in County Road 4, where an old mining museum kept a payphone for tourists. My lungs burned in the thin air at the top. I smashed the 4 quarters I carried into the slot and punched 911. The call connected to the Lake County Sheriff's dispatch. The operator's calm voice grounded me. I gave the address, explained the attack, described the 3 men, especially the one with the tan jacket and the black pickup with a dented right fender. She told me to wait by the museum because patrol cars were closer to me than to the cabin, and it was safer under electric lights. 20 minutes later, 2 deputies arrived. Deputy Ruiz and Deputy Harmon took my statement, then followed me back down to the cabin. Their cruiser was lighting up the woods in red and blue flashes. The men were long gone, of course, everywhere. The doorframe, but evidence was splintered, knife marks on the wood, pepper spray coating the porch rail like orange varnish. Ruiz photographed everything and bagged a balaclava that the attackers must have dropped when they fled. It smelled of sweat and bear spray. Harmon found boot prints in the mud, 3 distinct sizes. He measured tread patterns with a small ruler while explaining that most cabins up here stay empty, midweek easy targets for smash and grabs. Usually, the thieves take electronics, but sometimes they confront renters if they think the place is occupied by tourists with expensive cameras. Harmon said the gang may have followed me from Leadville. After noticing my car was full of gear, they asked for a list of stolen items. I checked every drawer, every duffel they took, almost to my shock. Nothing inside. Maybe the bear spray spooked them too. Quickly, they did, however, my car before I locked it. After the first knock, my DSLR 2 lenses and a laptop bag were gone. So was my wallet and a pair of wireless earbuds. Ruiz whistled. Softly, thieves, like small electronics that fence fast. The total loss was painful, but I was breathing, and Porter's tale still was. At 10:30 p.m., Ruiz radioed in, then suggested I follow them back to Leadville to file a full report. Staying in the cabin overnight was not recommended. I packed essentials, grabbed Porter's bed, and locked up in the cruiser. Headlights. The porch looked eerily normal, as if nothing had happened. I could almost see my 8-year-old self leaning over that rail, dropping pine cones to the ground below. I spent the night at a pet-friendly motel on Harrison Avenue, clutching Porter like he was the world's last blanket. I called my parents from the lobby's Wi-Fi. Dad cursed softly. Mom cried. Both begged me and to come home. I promised I would in the morning before Don Ruiz phoned my room to say state troopers had spotted a speeding black pickup near Granite, 40 minutes south. Description. They, matching my, tried to pull it over. The driver veered off, nearly hit a guardrail, then kept going toward Buena Vista with no plate number yet and no stop. I checked out at sunrise, and the motel clerk handed me a paper bag. Inside were my wallet and camera lenses. Deputies found them tossed behind a dumpster at a gas station outside town. The DSLR body and laptop were still missing. I thanked the clerk, loaded the Porter into the car, and drove east toward Denver every mile, feeling lighter only because it carried me farther from that porch. 3 weeks later, the sheriff's office called. Deputies in Salida had arrested a trio breaking into vacation homes. 2 brothers and a cousin from Pueblo. One suspect still bore burns on his cheeks from bear spray in their truck. Investigators found my DSLR laptop and a scratched cast iron skillet with a chip in the rim. They also found knives, pry bars, unregistered handgun. The Andon men admitted to knocking on doors, pretending they'd stayed there before then forcing entry. If the cabin seemed empty or occupied by a lone renter, they never expected pepper spray from inside. I reclaimed my property at the courthouse. Most electronics still worked, though the laptop smelled like motor oil. The sheriff shook my hand and said, I was lucky. I nodded, but felt no luck. Only the hollow echo of that first knock. I drove home, unpacked my gear, stored my gear and bear spray on the same shelf as my childhood scrapbook. I haven't returned to the cabin since. This happened to me when I was in college. I was 21 in early June of 2021, fresh out of finals at Western Washington University in Bellingham and worn down from 3 straight all-nighters. My roommates were scattering for the summer, but I still had 2 weeks before my part-time library job started again. I wanted quiet, the kind that lets you hear your breath. So, I booked a tiny cedar cabin on Airbnb. The listing said it sat on 5 forested acres off Lost River Road near Mazama, a speck of a town in northern Washington, a few miles from the Canadian border. The photos showed a single-room cabin with a broad front porch, a pot-bellied stove, and big windows that looked straight into the evergreens. It sounded perfect. I left Bellingham on a gray Monday morning, took Highway 20 east through Cedro, Woolley, and climbed toward the rainy pass. Patches of snow still clung to the shoulders, but the sky cleared as I dropped into the Metho Valley. Cell service faded after Winthrop. The farther I drove, the narrower the road became until it was just cracked asphalt, winding through towering Douglas firs. A hand-painted sign, Reading River Song Cabins, pointed down a gravel track. My little Honda rattled along for half a mile before the trees opened into a small clearing. There was the cabin, fresh stained cedar, a green metal roof, and a porch swing that faced the woods. I met the host, a retired teacher named Mary, who lived in a larger house beyond the trees. She handed me a real metal key, not a code, no Wi-Fi out here. She said with a smile landline, call the you need anything, cell towers don't reach past Winthrop. I told her that was exactly what I wanted, thanked her, and heaved my duffel. Inside the first evening, it felt like the start of a meditation retreat. I brewed coffee on a little propane stove, sat on the porch swing, and listened to the Methow River rushing somewhere below the ridge. The air smelled of pine sap around 10. I lit and distant rain the tiny wood stove, read a paperback under a lantern, and fell asleep to the soft tick of cooling metal. When sunlight woke me, a strange sight pulled me fully awake outside the front window. On the mossy ground, about 3 feet from the porch, sat a neat little pile of stones. Each rock was the size of a chicken egg stacked in a short cone, maybe 8 inches tall. I figured a squirrel or a raccoon had messed with stones from the driveway, but the pile looked too precise. I went outside, nudged it with my shoe, and the stack toppled. I shrugged, made oatmeal, then spent the day hiking a section of the Pacific Crest Trail near Cutthroat Pass. Only 6 other cars were at the trailhead. I passed fewer than 10 people all day. That night was quieter than the first. No wind, no river noise, just deep silence that pressed against the cabin walls. I lay in bed and caught myself straining to hear anything at all. Eventually, crickets resumed their faint chirping, and I drifted off. Morning light cut across the floorboards again. I stretched, turned toward the window, and my stomach sank. Another stone pile stood in the exact spot as yesterday, just as tidy and just as high. A cold prickling sensation at the back of my neck. Maybe Mary's grandkids played a joke. But she had said they lived down in Wenatchee. I went outside, snapped a photo on my phone, even though it had no service, and kicked the pile apart with more force than necessary. I spent that day kayaking the flat section of the Metho near Carlton. The river calmed my nerves, but while driving back up Lost River Road, I realized dusk was falling, and an irrational urge told me not to return. I turned onto the gravel anyway, because there was nowhere else to go. The cabin waited, shadowy and still. I lit the lantern early, pulled the curtains across the windows, and tried to read every 15 minutes. I peeked outside, nothing but dark trunks and the faint outline of the porch rail. Around midnight, I decided I was being ridiculous, slid into bed and wrapped the quilt tight. A sound snapped me awake. Wood creaking under weight. The porch swing often moved with the wind, but this was heavier, a single step that made the whole plank floor moan. I held my breath so hard my chest ached. The cabin had no lock on the bedroom door. It was a single room anyway, so all that stood between me and whoever was out there was the knob on the front door. Silence returned deep and full, followed by a soft scrape of stone on wood, I thought. Then nothing. Minutes crawled by. Finally, sunrise gray seeped around the curtain edges. I forced myself up in my heart. Hammering, pulled the drape aside. A third stone pile sat on the porch rail, perfectly centered right in front of the window where my head had been. I stumbled back, bile rising. That stack hadn't been there at midnight. Someone had built it, while I lay less than 6 feet away on the other side of thin glass. I yanked the curtains shut, threw clothes into my duffel, and jammed my feet into hiking boots. My hands shook so badly that I dropped the car keys twice. Outside, the morning was damp and chilly. I scanned the trees, half expecting someone to step out. Nothing moved. I thought about driving straight out, but anger bubbled up through the fear. I marched across the clearing to Mary's house. She answered in a bathrobe, eyes widening when she saw my face. I blurted everything out. The stone piles up against the creek, on the porch. To her credit, she didn't brush me off. She put on coffee and phoned the Okanogan County Sheriff's Office. A deputy named Ramirez arrived an hour later. He was in his late 30s, calm, and spoke in a low voice that steadied. We walked the cabin perimeter. He knelt near the porch, pointed to the flattened grass beneath the floorboards, and used his flashlight to peer under. "Someone's been crawling under here," he muttered. He eased himself flat and slithered halfway in when he backed out. He held a dirty blue sleeping bag, a crushed protein bar wrapper, and a cheap LED flashlight with dead batteries. "That's not yours, right?" he asked. I shook my head hard. He took photos, then led me a few yards into the trees behind the cabin, a narrow path I hadn't noticed. Wound. Deeper into the woods, bare patches showed fresh footprints, though rain had softened the edges. About 50 feet in, the trail widened into a clearing bigger than a living room. In the center stood another stone pile, taller, maybe 2 feet high next, and to it, a ragged army surplus backpack leaning against a stump. Ramirez unzipped it with a pen. Inside were men's thermal pants, canned beans, a hunting knife, a cracked leather sheath, and a spiral notebook. Many pages were torn out on one that remained. Someone had scrawled rows of tally marks in the words "night visitor" repeated over and over. My knees wobbled. The deputy called for backup to search the area, then walked me back to the cabin to pack up. He said gently the highway. As I'll follow you, to stuffed the last items into the car, Ramirez stepped onto the porch and studied the windows. "Did you notice anything else last night?" he asked. "No, I just heard the porch creak." Maybe the swing he pointed to. The swing's chains were still, but another detail made my skin crawl. The window glass was smudged with the faint outline of 2 palms, positioned as if someone had leaned close to the pier inside. I followed the patrol car down the gravel, heart slamming each time shadows, as flicked across the windshield at the paved road. He waved me on and turned back toward the cabin. I drove nonstop to a motel in Wenatchee, locked myself in a second-floor room, and kept the lamp on until daylight that afternoon. Ramirez called. Detectives and a tracking dog had combed the property but found no sign of the man. They followed footprints through the forest until they vanished near a service road. "Looks like he'd been sleeping under that porch for at least a week," Ramirez said. "My guess is he watched guests coming and going, waited for a solo traveler, and worked up the courage to get closer each night. I asked about fingerprints, the notebook that could ID, and anything him. No matches so far, he said. We'll keep the evidence. Mary's installing motion lights and cameras, but I wouldn't recommend staying there again. I emailed Airbnb from the motel lobby. Their support team offered a refund and a bland apology. That night before I hit the highway west, I sat in a parked car, scrolling through photos I'd taken the first day, the cabin, the river, the sunset, through pines, and one picture snapped at dusk outside the front porch. I noticed something I had missed. Between two fir trunks, far in the background, a pale oval shape hovered. I zoomed in until the pixels blurred. It was a face, featureless in low light, but unmistakably human, watching from the trees. As I smiled, obliviously at my camera, the realization made my stomach heave. That meant he had been there, the very first night. The stone piles were never a warning. They were markers measuring how close he dared to come. By the third night, the stones touched the building, and so did he, back on Highway 2. I kept checking the rearview mirror, even with daylight blazing across the Cascades, every time a car followed. For more than a mile, I changed lanes at home in Bellingham. I slept on friends' couches for a week, too jumpy to stay alone. Even now, 4 years later, I refuse any rental whose host brags about isolation. I need neighbors, streetlights hum of traffic, and the distant human presence that never sleeps. Some people find peace in silence. I learned that silence can hide someone who is already much too close. Years have passed, and I still replace small details. The first stone pile must have taken a few minutes to build. He did it steps from my bed, yet felt sure I wouldn't wake. The second stack showed he'd come back after I kicked the first one apart. The third proved he'd gained confidence, placing it right against the window. I wonder what the fourth night would have brought. The deputy guessed. He might have tried the door. Maybe nothing more than a scare. I don't share that optimism. The knife in the backpack suggests a darker plan. I asked Ramirez once if they ever found the man. He said, no, but suspected a transient who drifts between national forests each summer, living unnoticed. The notebook went into evidence, the backpack too, but without a name. The case grew cold. Sometimes I imagine hikers stumbling on a campsite miles off trail and finding those words, night visitors, scratched onto bark or stones arranged in small, perfect towers. The image wakes me in the middle of the night, sweating. Friends say I was unlucky. I tell them the opposite. I was lucky the porch creaked when it did. Lucky Ramirez believed me. Luckily, the guy ran instead of fighting. But I also know luck is just chance in disguise. Chance put him on that land before I arrived. Let him watch without bars on the windows. Let his quiet shuffle blend with the forest's hush. I gave myself every advantage by choosing absolute solitude. People love to use the word remote and travel blogs like it's a badge of courage or authenticity. They post photos of tiny cabins under big stars, praising the absence of neighbors. Those pictures rack up likes from city dwellers who crave escape. I end up staring at the backgrounds, searching for a pale blur between the trees. I still hike, still camp, but I never go alone, and I never sleep in a place where nobody would hear a scream. If that means I missed the pure silence of the back country, so be it. Silence isn't empty. Sometimes it's full of footsteps. You didn't notice until they stopped right outside your door. In late October of 2019, after too many months of overtime at my marketing job in Boston, I decided to rent a small log cabin near Stowe, Vermont. I wanted air that smelled like pine instead of car exhaust. And nights. So quiet, I could hear my thoughts. The cabin sat off a gravel road called Tucker Lane, 4 miles outside town, surrounded by sugar maples that were now fiery red and orange. The host, Janice Evans, that the closest messaged neighbor was about 50 yards away through the trees. She sounded proud of her privacy. At the time, I was grateful for it. I left Boston before sunrise on Monday, October 27th, followed Interstate 93, and until the mountains rose on both sides of the highway. Around 10 in the morning, I reached Stowe, stopped at the Shaw's on Mountain Road for groceries, and then drove north along Route 100. A small wooden sign for Tucker Lane leaned at an angle. By the turn, the pavement ended after a quarter mile, and my rental car bounced over washboard gravel. The cabin appeared on the left, like something from a postcard, fresh log walls, a green metal roof, and smoke drifting from a chimney through leafless branches. I could just see another house farther up the rise, a 2-story farmhouse, the color of sun-bleached bone. Its windows are dark. I assumed that was the neighbor Janice had mentioned. A lockbox held the key inside. The cabin smelled of cedar and old wood, smoke. One room held a couch and a stone fireplace in a small kitchen area. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom with a queen bed, a dresser, and one window looking toward the farmhouse. A sliding glass door at the back opened onto a deck above a shallow stream. I set my bags down, lit a fire from the stacked birch logs, and sent a quick text to Janice that I had arrived safely. She replied with a smiling face emoji and a reminder to keep the deck door latched at night, because black bears sometimes sniffed around. For the rest of that first day, I did little chores I normally rush through at home, sweeping fallen leaves off the porch, arranging the few fridge items, and brewing coffee just to smell it, filling the room by late afternoon. The sun was low behind Mount Mansfield, and the air turned sharp and cold. I pulled on a jacket and stepped outside to watch the sky change. That was when I met him. He came walking along the tree line between the two properties, a man in maybe his late 60s, cheeks red from the cold gray hair, pressed flat under a worn Vermont Catamounts baseball cap. He carried a silver thermos and waved as soon as he saw me. I raised my hand back, expecting him to keep going, but he angled toward my porch. "Evening," he said at the foot, stopping of the steps. His voice had that soft Vermont accent, gentle R's. That slid almost into the next word. Thought I'd introduce myself. Name's Harold Jensen. I own the old white place next door. I told him my name and said I was just renting for the week. He chuckled that it was a good time of year for peace for maybe 10 minutes. We chatted about foliage, early frosts, and the best place in town for apple cider donuts. He kept his distance, hands wrapped around the thermos like he was warming them before leaving. He tipped his cap and said he usually strolled each evening around 5 to stretch his legs if I were ever out. Then he'd be glad for the company. I said that sounded nice and wished him a good night. After he disappeared among the pines, I told myself it was wholesome, almost storybook-friendly local neighbor to meet a... The next morning, the cabin windows were fogged from the wood. I made bacon and eggs and spent hours on the deck with a paperback I had been meaning to read for months. The only sounds were crows, the rush of the stream below, and the occasional whoosh of an unseen car on Route 100. Around 4, I hiked a short section of the Catamount Trail, enjoying the crunch of leaves under my boots. When I got back, dusk was creeping in. I lit the porch lantern right on cue. Harold emerged from the shadows. This time, he stopped closer to the steps. He wore the same cap and a thick canvas coat. "Hope you found the trail." "All right." He said he had kind eyes, the watery blue that comes with age. I told yes, then asked how long he had lived up here. "All my life." He said the family bought the land before World War II. That is, it was quieter back then. He smiled to show he was half joking. We spoke about Boston, where his favorite team was Boston College hockey, and he teased that I probably hated the Bruins rivals. I noticed his hands trembled slightly when he sipped from the thermos. After about 15 minutes, he said he didn't want to keep me from supper, tipped his cap again, and walked back toward the farmhouse. I watched him reach the porch, open a side door, and slip inside. A light flickered on briefly behind a curtained window, then went dark. That night I dreamed of nothing special, no flickering lights or distant footsteps, only the soft rush of the stream outside. On Wednesday, the sky turned gray and spat light rain. I drove into town, wandered the shops along Main Street, and had lunch at Butler's Pantry. Back at the cabin, I built a stronger fire and listened to the wind push rain against the roof. At 5:30, a faint knock came at the front door. Harold stood on the porch, coat speckled with rain. "Figured I'd check you weren't drowning out here," he said with a thin laugh. I invited him in, but he shook his head, saying he didn't want to get mud on the floor. We spoke from either side of the threshold for maybe 10 minutes. He asked what book I was reading, and I held it up so he could see the cover through the screen. He squinted, smiled it in college, and said he'd read Thought later, that he must have been in college in the late 1970s, which lined up with his age. Before leaving, he reached out, touched the doorframe gently, and told me to be careful if I walked after dark. Coyotes followed the stream some nights. Then he disappeared again into the rain, leaving nothing but damp footprints on the porch planks. Thursday was Halloween, though tourist season had mostly wound down. Morning fog wrapped the trees in white cotton. I made oatmeal, answered a single work email out of guilt, then spent the rest of the day lounging. The silence began to feel heavy, like you noticed the hum of your nerves. Part of me was happy. Harold would probably stop by near dusk just to break the hush. He appeared even earlier, about 4:30, wearing an old-fashioned wool sweater that looked hand-knit. He waved, came up the porch steps, and leaned on the railing. We chatted about nothing, a black bear that had been spotted near Smuggler's Notch, the high school football team's record, and the chance of first snow by Thanksgiving. Eventually, I asked, "You get many? Do renters like me out here?" He's not so many since everything that happened across the way. He nodded backward toward his farmhouse. I waited, thinking he might explain, but he only stared into the pines. I asked what he meant. He opened his mouth, paused, then smiled like he decided on a simpler answer. With insurance. After some, just trouble storm damage. Boards went up, which makes folks uneasy, I guess. A voice in my head reminded me that the farmhouse windows had looked dark and dusty. Still, I had seen that porch light flick on 2 nights before. Maybe he only uses a few rooms now. It wasn't my business. The sun slipped behind the mountain, and shadows filled the clearing. Harold said he had to check on his generator before the rain returned, lifted a hand in farewell, and left. I closed the door, locked it, and then stood there, uneasy without knowing why the cabin suddenly felt too quiet to distract myself. I showered, cooked pasta, watched steam rise, and in the cold air near the window around 8. I poured a glass of water and opened my laptop to leave a middle stay review for Janice, figuring it was polite. In the message, I wrote that everything was perfect and added almost as an afterthought, "Your neighbor, Harold, very kind." Each evening has been the little online indicator showed she was typing. Then it stopped, then started again. Finally, a short reply appeared. "What, neighbor?" Confused, I wrote back to Harold Jensen, an older gentleman in the white farmhouse next door. This time, the dots lingered a long while. Her reply was 2 sentences. "I don't know anyone named Harold. That house has been empty since. The owner, Arthur Jensen, 2016. It's been disappeared and boarded up ever since." I felt a slow, cold crawl along my spine. Not the cliché jolt of terror, but the deep chill that happens when something ordinary suddenly doesn't fit. I typed, "I've been talking with him every evening. He said he lives there." Janice responded almost instantly. "No one lives there. I can call the sheriff if you want." My first thought was that she had to be mistaken. Or maybe I had misheard the name, but Jensen wasn't common, and the farmhouse looked exactly like a place left to the weather and dust. I walked to the bedroom window and parted the curtain. Moonlight revealed the old house through thin branches. All the first floor windows were covered with rough plywood sheets. There was no sign of a porch light. I don't know how long I stood at the glass, long enough for fog to form on my breath. I imagined Harold walking through the cold woods again, maybe carrying that thermos watching, maybe my cabin from the shadows. The rational part of me said this was a simple misunderstanding, but my heart was beating too fast. For a reason, I messaged Janice, thanked her, and said I'd be fine. She said to keep all doors locked and call if anything seemed off. I shut the laptop and stoked the fire until flames cast jittering shapes on the walls. Sleep didn't come easily. Each time the logs cracked, I jerked awake. Sometime deep in the night, the fire turned to glowing coals. I heard what sounded like footsteps on dry leaves outside the front door, slow and hesitant. I held my breath. The steps stopped. The porch planks didn't creak, and no hand tried the knob, but the silence felt heavier than any sound my phone showed. It was 3:12 a.m. I lay there eyes wide until dawn's first pale light leaked through the curtains. Friday morning, I told myself there had to be an answer. Maybe Harold was a caretaker, and Janice simply didn't know. Maybe he was squatting there without permission, but he was otherwise harmless. I made coffee, burned my tongue because I drank it too fast, and decided to hike into town to clear my mind. I walked the gravel lane toward Route 100 halfway down the hill. I passed a small clearing and found fresh footprints in the damp ground, larger and wider than my own, leading toward the boarded farmhouse. The prints were recent. The edges hadn't crumbled. I kept going. At the highway, I briefly thought about turning right to town, but instead crossed the asphalt and headed for the Santo Police Department. It sat behind Town Hall, a brick building that looked more like a library than a station. Inside, a single officer at the desk with a badge. Reading G. Perrin listened calmly as I explained. He asked basic questions: height, hair color, anything distinctive. I mentioned the Vermont Catmounts cap and the silver thermos. He nodded and said they'd check the area. He also told me not to confront anyone on my own. He took my cell number and promised to call if they found anything. I thanked him, bought a sandwich at the Green Goddess Cafe, and returned to the cabin. The afternoon dragged on. I tried to read but kept losing my place. Wind rattled loose, plywood somewhere, and every knock made me jump. By late day, storm clouds rolled over the mountaintops, turning the sky the color of wet slate. I half expected Harold to wander out of the pines again, but the clearing stayed. I couldn't decide if that was better or worse. At 7, the rain started hard and slanted. I lit every lamp in the cabin, as if brightness alone could chase away dread. While warming soup on the stove, I heard a thud from outside, then another. Slower, like someone testing each porch step. I turned off the burner and held my breath. The window beside the door showed only darkness and the reflection of my frightened face. Then came a voice muffled by the storm, but clear enough in the evening, saying, "Sorry to drop by late." My throat tightened. The voice was Harold's, yet something in its tone felt less warm, more urgent. "Could use a bit of shelter. Power's out on my side," he said. Every instinct screamed not to open the door. Instead, I called out as evenly as I could, and I had already called the police about you. Silence followed rain, and it hammered the roof for almost 30 seconds. There was no sound but the weather. I pictured him standing inches from the door, maybe shocked, maybe angry. Finally, he spoke again, softer, almost pleading. "I'm just a neighbor friend. No need for police. The place gets lonely. That's all." There was a long pause. "You said we could chat." I didn't answer. Another minute passed, and a single heavy footfall sounded on the bottom step. Then retreating footsteps squelched through mud, fading toward the farmhouse. I stood frozen until I realized the soup had burned. The scorched smell jolted me back. I dumped the pot in the sink, grabbed my phone, and called Officer Perrin's direct line. He said a unit was already en route to check the property, probably 20 minutes out. He told me to stay inside, lock up, and not engage. I thanked him and hung up. Lightning flashed, turning every window bright for white a breath, then black again. At that moment, I saw a figure halfway between the cabin and the boarded house, motionless among the pines. The next flash showed empty space. My pulse thudded so loudly I thought I could hear it. In my ears, red and blue lights finally flickered up Tucker Lane. Just after 9, 2 cruisers rolled onto the grassy shoulder beside the farmhouse. Officers shone beams across the porch, the door siding. I watched, and the warped from my window as they circled the building. One officer hopped onto the porch, tried the side door, then forced it open. They disappeared inside. A few minutes later, they emerged, shaking their heads. One gestured to the yard, pointing at tracks in the mud. Another officer followed the prints with his flashlight until the beam faded into thick undergrowth. After 15 minutes, Officer Perrin walked to my porch. I let him in his coat, and he drips puddles on the mat. "We found evidence. Someone's been inside," he said. "Food wrappers, bedroll, and some personal items. No, one is there now. The thermos you mentioned was on the kitchen counter." I asked if the name Harold Jensen meant anything. He flipped through notes. Arthur Jensen bought the place in '86, reported missing in December 2016. No immediate family. He cleared his throat. "We'll keep looking. It could be someone using the property illegally. Maybe a drifter pretending to be the owner." I almost told him Harold had said he'd lived there his whole life, that he knew local sports history and small-town gossip, but the words felt unreal in my mouth. Perrin advised me to leave the area tonight, if possible. I packed in under 10 minutes, tossing clothes into my suitcase, and drove toward town with officers tailing me until I reached the Trapp family lodge, where Janice had reserved a room. Sleep came in. Broken pieces, footprints, and dreams of wet silver thermos kept waking me. By dawn, the rain had stopped. Clouds hung low, and the mountains looked bruised purple. I checked out early, grabbed coffee, drove southward and Boston. When cell service returned near Waterbury, I had a voicemail from Officer Perrin. His voice was quiet. They'd found more evidence in the farmhouse, upstairs, family photographs of Arthur Jensen, and among them a picture that matched the man I'd talked with. The photo was dated 1998. They also found a death certificate. Arthur Harold Jensen, born in 1956, is presumed dead. As of January 2017, the officer ended by saying they would continue to investigate trespassing, but there was no sign of anyone on the property. Now, he suggested I contact them if I remembered anything else. Back in Boston that evening, I opened the picture. I'd snapped off the farmhouse on my first day when I zoomed in on something metallic, flashed in a bedroom window, just a blur of reflected light, the shape of a cylinder. The image resolution was poor, and it could have been anything. Yet my mind filled in the silver of a dented thermos. Weeks passed, and life became routine again. Deadlines, subway noise, neon lights outside my apartment. But sometimes when the city power cuts for a second and the room goes dark, I remember that gentle voice at the door asking to come inside, saying it was only lonely.